Hey everybody, Randy Patterson here with Boomerocity. And I've got an interview here for you that you may think that I've just gone off the rails as far as what I normally cover. And I've been known to do that from time to time, but there's a method to my madness. And on this one, I think you'll see it once you start getting into it. This book, entitled Smitty, that you see behind me, was co-written by a dear friend of mine by the name of Marshall Terrill. Now, if you've followed Boomerocity for at least the last year, you'll remember that I interviewed Marshall about a year ago regarding the book he co-wrote with Greg McDonald called The Colonel and Elvis, or Elvis and the Colonel. And that was a book that he co-wrote with Colonel Tom Parker's protege, Greg McDonald. And so I don't want to get into all that. It's a great book. I encourage you to check it out and watch the interview too. But this particular book is a book co-written by Marshall, and it is about a murder that took place in the mid 60s in Tucson, Arizona. So you may be asking, all right, Randy, why are you getting into murder books that have to do with something that took place over 60 years ago? Glad you asked. The reason why I'm covering this is, number one, Marshall's a good friend of mine, so I like taking care of my friends, but it's got to fit into the wheelhouse. Otherwise, you guys won't be interested in watching it. This book takes me back to my youth because the murders took place just before my family and I moved from Huntsville, Alabama to Phoenix, Arizona, and still have family in Tucson. And so that's number one. It took me back to my childhood and when we moved there. Number two, there were some other pop culture or entertainment related links to that include Elvis Presley and, I don't know, the Manson murders, things of that nature. You'll see how it all kind of ties in together as you watch this chat with Marshall. And I encourage you to buy the book. The book is a page turner. I'm not one normally to read books like this because it's just not where I typically land. But the reason why I agreed to read it is because, again, my friend Marshall. Number two, the book is incredibly interesting. Very, very interesting. There's ties to James Dean, the mafia, Elvis, Janis Joplin, on and on. You'll want to read this book. So without any further ado, here is my second interview with my good friend Marshall Terrill. And if you would hit like, subscribe, and share it with your friends, okay? It won't cost you anything and it helps us out a lot. Until next time, this is Randy Patterson with Boomerocity. Take care. Good morning, my friend. How you doing?
Oh, I'm way down there. Let me, how's this? Is this framed okay?
I think it's about as close to perfect as you can get for two
Good.
good-looking guys like us. I mean, what can we say, right? So,
That's
well,
funny.
hey, man, it's been a while. In fact, it was been since your last book about Colonel Parker. Which, by
Wow.
the way, how did that do for you?
Oh, it did really well. It sold like 50,000 copies. They printed 50,000 and they printed 50 and there were about 2,000 left over. And so
Wow, very
yeah.
good.
So and then now when there's like that, then they remainder it. So like I bought 300 copies and then my co-author his son was able to buy some, and so then the rest kind of go on Amazon and get a bargain price.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
they'll sell out of them eventually.
How's Greg's family doing since he passed?
The mother, I'm sorry, his wife, she's doing as well as she could. I mean, they've been married since, they were high school sweethearts.
Yeah, yeah.
The son's doing well. The son, he does extremely well as a videographer, but yeah, it's been tough.
Well, it happened so quick too. I mean, from my perspective, it did. I don't know if it had been lingering, but
No, absolutely. It was like from he got diagnosed in November, like 3 weeks before the book came out, and then died in February.
Yeah, well, you and I were shooting notes back and forth. I was going to be interviewing him too,
Oh, wow. I
and
forgot that.
yeah, and then you said he was ill, and of course, we kept that under wraps. But and then he next thing I know, you're telling me he's gone. I was like, holy
Yeah.
crap! I mean, that was quick. So, oh
Yeah.
man, this book.
And
Oh,
with
go
him,
ahead.
with him promoting it would have really gone through the roof, I think, because people can refute what I say, but they certainly couldn't refute what he had to say.
Yeah. Well, and I'm sure it would have warranted an appearance at one of the big Elvis week in Memphis and all that kind of stuff. I
Well,
guess. I don't know. I mean, as anal as some people are against the
no,
colonel.
believe it or not, Graceland does not like the narrative that Colonel Parker was a good guy. The Elvis has to be the good guy, and there has to be a villain.
Yeah. Yeah.
So they
Well,
play
there
that
was
narrative big time.
yeah, well, there was all that financial angling against them too. What has been some of the, and we're definitely talking about Smitty here in a minute, but I'm just curious, what has been now that it's been out for a year? Um, what what have you heard? What's some of the feedback, some of the blowback even about the book? Has there been any insiders saying anything or anything like that?
No, the interesting thing is now we're in a period where the old timers had their minds set, and the younger audience, believe it or not, were more willing to hear this story. And the interesting thing is Peter Goralnik's going to be coming out with a book about the Colonel, and the rumblings are that it's pro-Colonel. And Greg was actually giving Peter a lot of information, and he said, "I think Peter's going to write a very positive book about the Colonel." So
Wow.
it'll be one of those, we were the bellwether, but if Goralnik says, the colonel was a good guy, then that whole narrative then has to shift.
Yeah, yeah. Well, well, as I told you before, when you and I were exchanging notes about before I ever interviewed you about it, I mean, I remember clearly you asked me, "Did you see the Elvis movie?" And you and I hadn't exchanged a lot of notes at that point, and prior to that, had been mostly about our mutual late friend Ken Mansfield. And you shot me a note. And you said, "Did you see the Elvis movie?" I said, "Yes, I did." And while you were writing the note to me asking me how I felt about how they portrayed the colonel, was sending you the link to my review of it. And I saw the dot stop and you wrote back, you go, "You get it." Because
Yep.
I did. I mean, none of us were right there, but gosh, I mean, all you have to do is look at some of the video of the colonel. If nothing else, they portrayed him as a doofus, which he was anything but, you know. And
Yep.
there was just some things that were patently untrue. And the interview with Tom Hanks that said he was going to portray the colonel nicely. He promised that to his widow, and that did not happen, you know.
Yep.
So,
Yeah. A
so anyway,
lot of people got betrayed on that film.
yeah, yeah, definitely. So man, this book, I had to go back and kind of go through it again. Being older like I am, sometimes short-term memory can be a little challenging at best. But so I was going back through it all, leading up to this interview. And for me, Marshall, I got to tell you what my interest in is in this because you know me, I write about entertainment mostly. So this is typically a book out that would be outside my wheelhouse, right? But to me, it pulled me in indirectly. I mean, all the references about pop culture then, Smitty's affinity for Elvis as well as Diane's. Some of the characters that were in there that had ties to artists. And for me, as a kid growing up in Phoenix, and as you know, I'm here in East Tennessee now, so reading a book, man, I could smell the dust. I could feel the moisture of the swamp coolers.
Yeah.
Because I moved out there, my family and I moved out there midway through my fourth grade year in 1969. So, and our stop was in Tucson to visit with my aunt and uncle and my cousins who lived in some of the area there that you mentioned in the book. And so to me, that took me back then. Then, of course, I had to remember the Bulls bombing and all the trials around that and the organized crime and all that kind of thing. And I didn't tell you this before. Another thing that was a big outcrop from the 60s and 70s for me personally is there was, I don't know if you recall, there was the big deal about the William Wayne McCumber murder trial. He was accused of killing a couple out in the desert in the greater
No, I don't
Phoenix
remember
area.
that one.
You Google that sometime, but
I will. William Wayne
his,
McCumber. Okay.
yeah, I went to his parents went to my little church that I went to at the time in Phoenix. And we heard a lot of the inside stories about all that. And I went to one of his hearings as a kid, and then I sent him some books for Christmas one time. Then I lost contact with him. He's dead now. I don't want to ruin the surprise for you. It's a sad ending,
Okay.
but check out his story sometime. Not that you'll ever want to do another
You never
crime
know.
book.
You never know. I'm thinking of doing a bio of Schmitty, like a full on, because we've got we did this documentary. We it's not finished, but we interviewed well over 40 people. So it would be more of a 360 perspective of Smitty. And any book like that's going to give you a different look, and you have different interactions. On this, you've got one point of view.
Yeah. So to that point, how did this book come about for you? How did you and Diane Schmid get together on this? What tell people what that was all about. And
Well, let me go back into the whole backstory real quick. So I had first heard about Schmid. I want to say in the early 2000s, I had started a friendship with a gentleman by the name of John Gilmore, and
yeah,
you read his name in the book. Gilmore was a great author, but he was also an actor back in the 50s. And I first met him when I was doing my book on Steve McQueen.
okay.
And he and McQueen did not get along. And when we started talking, he's like, "I'm not going to give you anything good about McQueen." I said, "Look, when you do a book, you've got to do the good, the bad, and the ugly. Whatever you want to give me, that's what I'm going to write about." So um, I met him, and then I started like, "Oh, you've written books," and then so he started telling me about Schmid. So there was nothing more than just a like, "Oh, well, that's interesting," kind of feeling on my part, but at least a seed was planted, and that was in the early 2000s. And so, about 2022, me and two of my coworkers decided to form a documentary company, and we wrote down 20 ideas of the best documentaries that we could do with the Southwest. And Schmid immediately rose to the top. And the reason why is
Wow.
because that murder, it wasn't to do a story about a serial killer. That murder changed the innocence of Tucson. And so
Yeah.
it was more than just, a guy killing three teenage girls. It was, these were crimes that shocked the nation to the point where Life magazine decided to write a 16-page article, which they had never done. They'd never done true crime before. And so this was big enough to warrant a big piece in that. And then, of course, Time, Newsweek, they all came to cover this trial. So as we were doing this documentary, word just kind of gets out. So Schmitty's wife, widow, Diane, I happened to just email his sister or her sister. And the sister then told Diane and said, "Yeah, this guy's legit." So then Diane reached out to me and said she'd like to be a part of the documentary, which shocked me. And I said, "Well, okay, we'll put you in silhouette. You don't have to worry about." She's like, "Why would I do that? I'm proud of being Schmitty's wife and his widow." And I was like, "Oh, okay, interesting. I got to get you on camera." So we developed this text relationship, and then we did the interview, and she was just really honest, because usually, with when you hear about serial killers' widows, they all say, "Well, I didn't know, I had no clue," and that was the case here. So I wanted to know the story from her perspective, but as we were doing after we were done doing that interview, I said, "Diane, this is a book." I said, are you interested in doing a book with me?" She said, "Absolutely, I would." She goes, "I want to get my side of the story out there." So that's what happened. That's how this collaboration came together.
Wow. I I mean, as I alluded to a minute ago, I mean, the book is so well written. Like I said, having grown up in Arizona, I could, the book took me back to the dust and the swamp coolers, right? And so I commend you both
Thank
for that collaborative effort. It's very excellently done. Um, you mentioned Gilmore. I'm going to jump all over the place, man. There's normally I like to go in a nice, methodical, linear fashion, but my mind just goes all over with this book. Maybe I'm ADHD, I don't know. But you mentioned Gilmore, and again, this book hooked me because of the pop culture, the entertainment of the time. And I mean, Gilmore is no slouch. You mentioned he was a former actor. He knew James Dean. He knew Marilyn Monroe. He knew Dennis Hopper. He knew Janis Joplin. I mean, he had me at James Dean. So
Well,
I
in
mean,
addition to that, he wrote a book about the Black Dahlia, and he would get phone calls once a year on the anniversary from this guy that he thought was the Black Dahlia's killer. And the interesting thing is that the Black Dahlia story has been told so many times and has been what's the word I want to use? Bastardized. But if they were ever to tell Gilmore's story, that would be the one, to me, that would be like, okay, that's the story. But yeah, Gilmore was the kind of guy that, and again, keep in mind, this was in the early, yeah, early to mid 60s and 70s. When he would write a book, he would actually move to the location. So he did a book
wow.
on Bonnie and Clyde, and he moved to Texas for a couple of years just to write that story. And I get it. I wouldn't do it because I like my personal comfort. In this particular case, the story was in Tucson, and which is 2 hours away, and I could go there. But Gilmore would go there and live and talk to the locals and get embedded in that community. And again,
Mhm.
this was during a time when you were a writer, you were living off of your checks and existing, whereas I can work now and I can do writing also on the side. But his was a little bit harder of a toe, you know what I'm saying? So he
Yeah.
was a very, very hard-boiled writer. And so I was lucky to have that friendship and his confidence. But yeah, Gilmore was definitely a key figure in the story too.
Is he still alive?
No, he passed away, I believe, in 2017.
Oh, wow. I didn't realize he wrote. I mean, I'm a Bonnie and Clyde nut, right? I've been to Bonnie's grave. I've been to the ambush site. I mean, when I saw the Warren Beatty movie when I was in third grade, that kind of warped me at that point. Right?
Yes.
So I'm going to have to see if I can find his book on Bonnie and Clyde. Um, One thing I found a correlation, I'm sure you did too, but I didn't see it mentioned in the book, was, well, I'm getting ahead of myself. I don't want to ruin the book. I want people to buy it and enjoy reading it, but maybe give a little synopsis for people who aren't familiar about this story, what this story is about. Because if I share it, I might say too much more than you want me to, and I don't want to ruin sales. So you share what this book is about.
Well, I mean, I'll just tell a little bit of the story, and that is Charles Schmid was uh, a champion high school gymnast, and but he was about 5'4", very slight, maybe 120 pounds, small guy who as he got older, wanted to draw more and more attention to himself. So, for example, he had his hair slicked back in a pompadour like Elvis. He wore
Mhm.
pancake makeup. He painted a mole on his face, which would get bigger and bigger. He put a bandage on his nose because he was telling people that he had a Harley Davidson and he got in an accident and broke his nose. And then he put toothpaste on his lips. So he appeared a little freakish for the time, but he had no problem attracting women. There was just
Mhm.
something off and different about him. But he would do a lot of these outrageous things and draw attention to himself. But then it kind of hit a dark point where he decided, I feel like I want to kill somebody today. And so he tended to befriend people that were kind of cast outs in school. But because he was the cool guy in school, right? He had the great car. Um, he he had money in his pocket because his parents ran a nursing home and they gave him an allowance of a stipend, I should say, of $300 a month.
A
And
lot of
so
money back then.
a lot of money back then, and he had his own house. They had two homes, and they let him have one. He was adopted, so the mother overcompensated and gave him everything. So he felt like he could do anything that he wanted. So when he got to his, after he left high school, and he a week before graduation, he stole something out of the shop class, and he got caught. And they gave him the opportunity to apologize and give the tool back, or he wouldn't graduate. He opted not to graduate, not to apologize. And so from that point on, his life just kind of goes downhill because he's got nothing going on. I mean, you know those guys in high school, right? They were something in high
Mhm.
school, and then when they get out, well, their lives kind of just end. They dead end. And he was one of those people.
Like the uncle on Napoleon Dynamite, right? So
Oh, that's funny. That's exactly right. So Smitty then kind of, again, he befriends a lot of younger people that he can manipulate. And so he decides one night that he wants to kill somebody. And he gets his sometime girlfriend, Mary Ray French, who was a neighbor of this young lady, together with another gentleman on the auspices of a double date. They lure her out while her mother was a nurse, went to work, and then they lure this young lady out. Her name was Eileen Rowe, and so they lure her out, and then they take her to the desert, and then they kill her.
Mhm.
And now it was Schmitty and it was John Saunders who killed her. Mary Ray French had nothing to do with the killing, other than luring her out of the house.
Right.
So this goes unsolved for about a year. Saunders moves away. Mary Ray French goes to Texas, and life goes on for Charles Schmid. And then he has another girlfriend named Gretchen Fritz, and he and Gretchen are like oil and water, and they do not get along. But he decides one night to take her to the gravesite of Eileen Rowe because she doesn't trust him and is always calling him day and night. Where are you? What are you doing? Are you cheating on me? Are you doing this? Are you doing that? So one night he decides, okay, maybe if I bring her to the gravesite of Eileen Rowe, I will build trust with her, and we won't have this, and we won't have these fights any longer. Well, Gretchen decides that she's going to use this against him, and over the course of several months, I'm going to tell. And then one night she decides that, well, while she's at a drive-in movie theater with her younger sister, Wendy, she hears that there's a party going on at Schmid's house. And then she's angry, calls him, says, I'm coming over. He tells her, don't come over. She comes over. Um, he strangles her, and then Wendy's on the couch watching TV, who's 13 years old, and then he has to decide what he's going to do with her. So he decides to kill her as well, and then he dumps their bodies in the desert. And so then he decides to enlist the help of one of his friends by the name of Richard Bruns, because the mafia then pays him a visit, and they're asking where these two girls are. And Richie Bruns happens to be there. And so Schmid happens to bluff his way out of it. And then he and Bruns actually just says, we need to go bury those bodies like deeper so that they're never found. And so Bruns kind of gets himself involved in it. Um, and then the mafia actually takes these two guys to San Diego, where they where Schmid tells these guys that that's where he saw Gretchen last. And so anyway, they're trying to find these girls, and the reason why they're trying to find these girls is the Fritz daughters. The Fritz girls are the daughter of James Fritz, who is a very, very prominent heart surgeon, and he's the
Mhm.
heart surgeon for a mafioso by the name of Joseph Bonanno. So It's so it's this whole story and how it all interweaves together. And then of course F. Lee Bailey gets involved later on. And so as you can see, it now makes for the makings of a national story.
That I know. I kept reading this and thinking, gosh, I mean, when I heard that about the mafia, I was thinking you would have thought Smitty could have won the lottery or something with some of the luck he had. But I mean, clearly he was narcissistic and a sociopath. But one thing that struck me, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seemed to me like he hid that pretty well.
Right.
And that this whole murder thing was probably, if you keep Gretchen and Wendy out of the picture, that it may have been I mean, I'm not minimalizing this. I'm just, you know, stepping back, taking emotions out of it because I'm a father of a daughter and I can think only but by the grace of God, right? So, but it sounds like everything would have been copacetic to a point if all he did was, kill Ali and no one else. I mean, I don't think Gretchen would have happened. I don't think, or her sister, but, it just seems like he was able to contain, and it really wasn't so much a double life. I mean, he was pretty linear in from what I gather. Do you agree?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, my editor and I were trying to come up with a name with him for him, a nickname, and she came up with something that was that was pretty apropos. She called him a blasé butcher. He killed, didn't really think about getting caught, went on with his life, and expected loyalty from others. And they say the thing about sociopaths and psychopaths is that they have darkness in their lives, but they also have that light that covers up that darkness. So they are
Yeah.
able to move around in society okay. And you're right. Who knows if he hadn't killed Wendy and Gretchen, if Eileen's case would have ever been solved.
Or if he would have killed again. I mean, he experienced it once. It's almost kind of like, meh, you know, he wrestled with guilt. So I would say he was probably a low level sociopath to a certain extent. I mean, it seems like,
Right. Right.
yeah.
He felt like he was able to move on with his life. Even when he was behind bars, if you recall, he received a letter from a former music teacher who said she could hook him up with a
RCA.
recording executive. And he was dreaming of becoming this rock star. And so that to me, that says a lot about, a guy that he's behind bars for three murders, and he's thinking, "Hey, man, one day I'm going to get out of here." So I don't know if he's the eternal optimist or if he's just fooling himself.
One similarity, and this is what I started saying earlier before I asked you to just, tell people about the book. I mean, what is it about mass killers or serial killers and wanting to be a rock star? I mean, you had the same thing with Manson, Smitty. I mean, Smitty thought he was going to be the next Elvis,
Yeah.
from your perspective, from all the research you've done, what correlations besides that do you see? What do you think the common thread is there that gives these people this, how do they go from the adoration of being a rock star to killing somebody, killing a bunch of people, you know?
Well, my next book is on Jay Sebring, and he was a Manson victim. And we wrote a chapter about cults in California and how they start off as one thing and then they end up being here. So, for example, the Manson family, they really started off as a crime syndicate. And if you ever watched that movie, The Source Family, about
Mhm.
Jim Baker, they started off as a vegetarian restaurant, and then somehow they find themselves as a cult. So there's always that the intention is to start off one way, and then they end up another. So, Schmitty and Manson, they had dreams of becoming a rock star, but then their lives evolved and changed, and then they became these killers. That's the only correlation I can really draw.
Yeah. Was there, did Diane show you any of his work as far as
Yes.
music and stuff? What was your take on it?
Not music, artwork that he did in prison. For example, he made a leather wallet. And you'll have a picture of that. As
Yeah,
long he did this tin artwork of the Last Supper, which was
that's
extraordinary. And
beautiful. Yeah.
yeah, and she still has that. But no, we don't have any recordings. As a matter of fact, we don't even have any recordings of his voice. Um, when the trial took place, they did not allow cameras in the courtroom. And so any reporting that was done, and remember, the trial took place in 66. So the only recording that was ever done was a radio station that interviewed him right before the trial. And I've been trying to locate that. And that was supposedly in Gilmore's uh, papers at a college. And I wanted access to that. They still haven't been able to locate it. But
Wow.
but I asked Diane, I said, what did his voice sound like? I said, what celebrity can you attribute his voice? She goes, he sounded like Nicolas Cage.
Wow. Two steps removed from Elvis.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. That's the same
And
thing.
did she mean that as a compliment?
No, she just stated it as fact.
Ah, okay.
I just asked her, what does his voice sound like? I said, because I'm trying to locate that tape. She said, well, because we were thinking maybe for the documentary, we'd try to use that tape and use AI to try and have him narrate some of the story. And so that's why I
Wow.
said that, hey, what did his voice sound like? She said, yeah, Nicolas Cage. Okay, interesting.
Very interesting. One thing I noted about him too, which you documented very, very well, and Diane seemed to share quite a bit of, is his relationship with his parents, especially between he and his mom. His mom, I mean, being so dominating, so cold, and and him being adopted. I mean, I know people who are adopted,
Mhm.
and it does there is that little sliver of that tinge of it seems like, and I'm not casting dispersions on them. I can only imagine what that feels like to find out you're adopted and that for whatever reason your parents either rejected you or were taken away from you. That's got to hurt and hurt deeply. Um, how much of a role do you feel that his relationship with his mom or with his parents in a broader sense, and the fact that he was adopted, how much of a role did those two aspects play in doing what he did?
I think it played a very big role because we interviewed a lady that dated, for the documentary that dated Smitty, and she said he once confided in her, "I don't feel like these people are my parents." He goes, "I don't look like them. I don't act like them. I have none of their traits." And then she told us one day of how he found out. That was he was snooping through the closet, and he came across these papers, and then found out that he was adopted, like around the age of 18. And
Wow.
this was a little bit after the graduation, so you can see where that mental slide started taking place when he was 18, and he commits these murders at 22. But the physical appearance he starts changing, starts hanging around different people, starts doing weird stuff, and so I believe that haunted him. And then another friend told us that he actually went to go visit his birth mother, and she opened the door and said, I didn't want you when you were born, and I certainly don't want you as an adult. I'll
Oh
slap you on his
man.
face."
Do
So
you think that's true?
I believe that's true.
Wow.
Yeah.
Because he did seem to make up some stories from what it sounded like. Told, kind of even Diane kind of said that how he would kind of twist the narrative a little bit to suit his needs.
Sure. Sure. But
So,
when you study people, sometimes you just gather this sixth sense of this is kind of a lie. This is this might be
Hmm.
true. This, that one hurt, that one cut to the core. So you could kind of piece where that happened. Unfortunately, his adoption is sealed. So, but he had told Diane that his name was Angel Rodriguez and his mother was Hispanic. I don't
Hmm.
know if that's true or not, but his adoption papers are sealed even to this day. So
Really?
I'm gonna try.
Wow.
I'm gonna try and get that unsealed. See who his real mother was, because there's
So
been
that
pretty wild rumors who his mother was.
I can imagine. A Manson girlfriend, who knows? Um, what? So if one thing that came to mind, if his mother was Hispanic, of course, no mention of who his father would have been,
Right.
but why would he have dyed his hair black if he had Hispanic origins? That question
Right.
kind of popped up in my mind as I was reading the book. It
Right.
seems kind of counterintuitive, don't you think?
Yes, because Diane said that his hair was kind of naturally reddish brown, and that he would actually
Hmm.
just like Elvis. You can see in that picture there, he kind of looks like Elvis in the early '60s.
Yeah,
On the
yeah.
cover there. Yeah, so he's got the little Elvis pompadour, but like, yeah, from like Viva Las Vegas. But yes, his natural hair color was like a reddish brown, and he dyed it for whatever reasons.
In the book, Diane shares what his missive about what took place on all three murders. And, I thought it was fairly straightforward. I thought he left some room there, casting some shade away from him that puts him in a little bit better light. Not that you can
Right.
ever justify three murders, but what was your take on that whole thing that he wrote?
Oh, I absolutely believe it, and I think there's a line there where she says, and I believe that he might have minimized his crimes, which I believe he did. But what you're referring to is 4 years after his, 3 years after his death, uh, he had this correspondence with a journalist by the name of oh gosh, I had it at the tip of my tongue. Anyway, with I think the Arizona Daily Star, Ken Burton was his name, and over the years, Ken had been trying to get Schmitty to admit or tell his side of the story, and so Schmitty said, "I'm not going to have you write it, but I'll write the story, and then you put it out or you edit it as you see fit." So this story actually came out 3 years after Schmitty was killed in prison. And but basically Schmitty finally admitted to what he had done, but of course minimizing, alcohol was involved. I was drunk. Saunders hit her over the head with a rock, but I just helped bury the body. But what he did was it was kind of contributory. From what I understand, Saunders hit her over the head with a rock. She wasn't quite dead, and then Schmitty choked her and killed her. And then they both buried her. But in his story, Saunders killed her with a rock, and he was just being a good guy, protecting his friend. And then he does admit to killing Gretchen, but again, it was she got me angry, she got me mad, and then he with Wendy, he said, uh, "Oh, I know what he said. He said with both of the girls, he drank so much he blacked out, and when he woke up, both were dead."
Yeah.
So it's obvious to me that he minimized what he had done, but at least he admitted that he was responsible for their deaths.
Well,
So
he even was saying that they were high or something, didn't he?
I believe he had yes inferred that.
Yeah.
So
Well, and on the first murder, he implied that um well, he said that what now I there's so many names floating around. Wasn't it Paul Ginn that on for the first one? Didn't he wasn't there I seem to recall that there was something about, Paul was basically saying he didn't rape her or something like that. So there must have been some sexual activity taking
yep,
place before The young lady was murdered. Is that
Yeah,
correct?
it was Saunders, not Paul Ginn, but Paul Ginn
Oh,
plays a
Saunders. Yeah.
role in it. Yeah, but he was saying Saunders raped her and then hit her over the head with a rock, and then they buried her. So yes, that was on Saunders, who is still alive, by the way, and he was given a life sentence, but he got out in 1990, so he's out there somewhere. So
Wow.
all of Schmid's accomplices are still alive. Mary Ray French is out there somewhere. Richard Bruns, who I actually talked to on the phone, is still alive. But I
Wow.
want to make it clear he didn't have anything to do with their murders.
Of course
But
not.
he was the one who turned them in. Um, and uh, and then the person who killed Schmid is out there somewhere.
Wow. Now, Bruns, interesting character. Um, I mean, there are times where because of what was documented about his behavior, I mean, I could see where it would very easily been him that did Gretchen and Wendy, and kind of almost like a I don't know, almost like a jealousy thing over and a protectiveness he had towards Smitty and how Gretchen was acting towards
Right.
um, and about Smitty. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, again, I really don't think he had anything to do with their murders. He was a juvenile delinquent who committed these crimes. He did help Schmitty bury their bodies, but they were already dead.
Yeah, yeah,
And of course, later on, he then came to the police and admitted his role in this, and then of course that helped lead to Schmitty's conviction. But he was more into the juvenile delinquent stuff. He had a record for breaking into cars, I think, breaking into homes,
hmm
um, just all sorts of stuff that he was a troubled guy. He later became actually a very respectable teacher, and retired as a teacher. But
I'll be darned.
so some people they do stuff in their youth that's stupid, and they mature and they grow older. And I think that's what happened with Bruns. Um, but some of these other people, I'm not so sure how they ended up, but they seem to be a little bit more hardcore.
Yeah. Well, Diane seems to still hold some very hard feelings towards Paul Ginn, if I'm pronouncing his last name correctly.
Right.
Explain that dynamic there.
Well, Paul Ginn was a childhood friend of Schmidt's. And when Paul, I think, was 15, he and another buddy, not Schmid, went out in the woods or they ran away from home and they lived out in the woods for a couple of days. And then they started getting hungry and starving, and they decide that they're going to rob somebody because they have their shotguns. And again, keep in mind these guys are only 14 and 15. And Ginn pulls over a military guy off of Mount Lemon, waves him down, and then puts the gun in his face. And then, I think he accidentally shot him in the face. And then he went away for 5 years, I believe. So then he comes back into Schmidt's life as he and Diane are courting, and and Ginn is very angry for whatever reasons at Schmitty that he's marrying this young girl. And then he and Schmitty have a falling out. But his timing is interesting in terms of when he left, because he was living with Schmitty and then he left, but he left like the day before the Gretchen and Wendy were killed. And then as I went through the police and FBI files, the FBI had a fingerprint of him on Gretchen's car. So even though he was never um, tried for anything, he was brought back to town for the trial, but he claimed that the sheriff threatened him and said, "You're going to testify against Schmidt, and if you don't, I'm going to bring you up on charges because I got your fingerprint on the car." So his role is an interesting one. I mean, this is all, as you can tell, a very convoluted story, and it kind of
Yeah.
takes years to understand all the intricacies and the details. Because as I was studying and researching this, it's like, man, doesn't make sense. what finally made sense to me, how I made sense of it was I have a subscription to newspapers.com. So then what I was doing was I was reading on a daily basis how things were happening and how it transpired in real time. So that's how, because there were a couple of books that were written before and they were, and God bless these writers in the 60s and 70s, they didn't have any technology. They had to
Right.
kind of they had to gumshoe everything, right? They had to go to the sources, which is great. But for them to kind of piece the story together is tough. So
Yeah.
you read these old books, it was kind of like a mishmash of timelines and getting it right. But when I was able to make notes from newspapers.com, I was like, okay, here this is how it all laid out. And so that's how we were able to lay out the story. But I laid out the story through Diane's eyes as it unfolded through her because that was kind of a different storytelling method to use.
Yeah. But as a reader, and no emotional ties to anyone in the story except yours and mine friendship, I kind of take it that after all these decades, I mean, he still has a little bit of a hold on her. Is that a fair assessment?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, again, when she confessed that she's still in love with him, it's shocking. But what I try to tell people is you have to understand this was her first love, right? We all carry a torch for our first love, you know?
Hmm.
And so when that name is mentioned, it's always with, great reverence or great love or great affection. And, and you have to also understand her personal situation. She was 15 at the time, I think, that they met. And, she had a very rough upbringing in terms of just very, very poverty stricken. She
Hmm.
was the second oldest daughter. The first daughter um, got married like at 16. And then all the family responsibilities sort of fell on Diane. She was changing diapers, cleaning the house, looking after her younger siblings, and then Smitty comes along and absolutely sweeps her up off her feet. And he's courting her with the guitar and Elvis love songs, and they're driving around all day and cruising, and it's just every day's a vacation. And then
Yeah.
when they get married, they have their own home and they immediately set up house. And money is kind of no object. They don't have to do anything. They can just wake up every morning, not have to go to work, and so they're newlyweds and everything's so fresh. So she had what I call 17 days of bliss. And then of course on that 17th day, Schmitty gets hauled off in handcuffs by the police. But it's like he
Oh.
was yanked out of her life and it was unresolved. So I can see why she would have those unresolved feelings towards him.
Well, and that's not an unusual thing because I found not a mass murderer, but a dead rock star where Patricia Keneally Morrison, I mean, she had a brief encounter with, Jim Morrison. They do the wedding of the hand fasting ceremony as portrayed in the movie. And right up until the day she died, I mean, she's saying they were husband and wife. And I mean, she never remarried. She never moved out of that apartment that they were married in. And I mean, it stayed with her until her last breath. And there's just something about people. Again, there's that whole rock star tie in there too, but it just blows my mind. And in the case of Diane, I found myself kind of waffling along with her as I'm reading her words and that, on one hand, this is horrible. On the other hand, that's my husband. And she had remarried after, after all this. And so, which brings me to another question. I noticed she uses the Schmid name on the book, although
Yeah.
she had remarried. Has she legally changed her name back to Schmid, or was this for the purposes of
This is
publication?
purposes of the publication. She has a totally different name, and um, we don't identify where she lives because she wants to have some sort of semblance of anonymity. But yeah,
Yep.
it was simply for the purposes of the book. But again, she did. I think she subsequently married three or four times after the fact.
Mm,
And her second husband, sadly, was in a car accident,
I saw that. Yeah.
hit a speed rail, and it sliced through the car and then glanced up towards the driver, which was him, and then severed his head. So,
Wow.
she had some really bad luck with her husbands, and then husband three and four, they were drinkers, and so you ever see that Seinfeld episode where where George has this girlfriend in prison, and it works because he knows
She's in
where.
prison.
Well, that's kind of how this relationship worked. Schmitty was always there. He was always going to love her. All these other things were happening to her outside of, prison, but he was always going to be the steady in her life, and that's just how things worked out. So I think that's where
Wow.
that affection comes from.
Where now the book's not out yet, right? It's in the process of
Correct, March 1st.
right. Of those who have read the book, and thank you for trusting me with the book, um, of those others who have read the book, what kind of feedback are you getting so far?
That it's an unusual book, which is fine by me. I mean, uh, I think that people weren't they're not ready to hear, that a serial killer's wife hasn't moved on. But I didn't want to be a PR guy and say, oh, I think this is what you should do. This is how this should play out. I wanted to capture her as she felt things. And so it's a strange and unusual story. And it doesn't have a neat ending. But I'm one of those guys that likes those films of the 60s and the 70s. I don't like neat and tidy endings because this doesn't have one. I mean, she's lived in the shadows for 60 years, and she's had some anger towards what happened to her because she basically was run out of Tucson. And then of course she had the succession of husbands that didn't work out. And so people wanted a neat and tidy story, and I don't think they're going to get it with this one.
No, clearly, I mean, it's a page turner. I mean, even when I revisited the book, I found myself like drilling into it. And I was like, no, I need to I need to keep going here so I could get my questions together. There was one line that he wrote in a letter to Diane that I thought was, without giving him any glory, I just thought it was a very poignant line that he wrote. He said, when he realized that, you know, after the first trial, he was going to be sentenced to death, he wrote in the letter, he goes, well, maybe they have guitars in heaven. I was
I
like,
remember that line.
that that's that was just like, okay, that rock star dream still kind of hanging on there. If there's rock stars in heaven, you know. But
Yeah.
well, man, this book, I can't say enough about it, Marshall. It's just phenomenal, and I think clearly you've had your niche with the entertainment industry, and now with this, I mean, I don't know if there's anything there on the Macumber thing that I told you about. Someone who came to mind that I would love to hear their story today, although I think she may be a little bonkers. I don't know. Is Marina Oswald,
Right.
and their kids. Her and Lee's kids. I know she was still living in the greater Dallas area, at least 15 or so years ago. But I mean, those stories I think are fascinating, even if they are a bit biased in their approach to things. But I think her last name is Porter now. But and I don't know. She may have died already, but as far as 15 years ago, she wasn't. She was still alive. But you have this knack of beautifully telling a story, very engaging. Like I said, I could smell the desert dust and the swamp coolers, man. And I mean, you nailed it well. And so you alluded to some other books that and projects you're working on. What's on your radar next, and what can we look forward to in the future?
Well, the Jay Sebring book is next, and again, Jay was the celebrity hairstylist that really brought men's hair design to the United States, and so uh, he was killed by the Manson family trying to defend Sharon Tate. And
Mm.
so I co-wrote this book with Anthony DiMaria, who was Jay Sebring's nephew, and so that allowed the family perspective to come in of Jay and give us his background, where he came from, how he built up his business, how he really revolutionized men's hair. It is now a $30 billion a year industry, and Jay was the guy that invented that. He was way before Vidal Sassoon. He was coming out with a line of hair products, um, and then of course gets murdered by the Manson family, and then his reputation is dragged through the mud because there was all sorts of allusions to satanic worship and drugs. And so we say in the book he was killed three times: his physical body, his reputation, and then sadly what happened was is that his business uh, went down the drain and was put into bankruptcy, and then other people bought the name and then became millionaires themselves. So it's
Mm.
really, the half of the story is like this guy's a rock star, he's living the life, and then the other half is, man, anything that good ever happened in his life became very, very tragic. And so
Wow.
this is the first bio of Jay Sebring, who was definitely worthy of a bio because he cut the hair of Steve McQueen, Paul Newman, the Rat Pack. Everybody in Hollywood wanted to go to him. He was charging $100 a haircut when the going price was like $5. So
Wow.
he was able to tap into the creme de la creme of Hollywood. And once they got their hair cut by him, they didn't go anywhere else because they wanted to look good.
Yep.
You talk about hair, back in the 50s, everybody had a butch cut, right? That was kind of it. And then he came in with the longer blow dried cut look that you see
Hmm.
today. It's very, very
Yep.
timely.
Very
So
cool. When is that coming out?
that's coming out in July.
All right.
And then I've got a third book coming out in 2025, a coffee table book on the making of Steve McQueen's last two movies, Tom Horn and The Hunter. And the photos
Whoa.
were provided by his widow, Barbie McQueen.
Wow. All right, buddy. We got to talk on those, man. Those are right up my alley. So let's yeah, the door is always open to you, as you know. So but
It.
again, this book, I when you first turned me on to it and said it was coming out, I have to admit I was like a little hesitant because I thought, man, this is outside my wheelhouse. But man, from like page two on, I was in, and I was reading it on my iPad, and I was just like, I couldn't read fast enough. It's very, very well written, and I'm not just saying it because we're friends. It's an amazing book, and my compliments to Diane as well, if you could pass those along. And I hope it does well, and I hope it helps somebody. I think a book like this, there could be a woman out there that reads it and goes, "Oh my gosh, this sounds so much like me. I need help." And hopefully that happens. Or a young man who is another Smitty is saying, "Look, man, I see me in this guy. I need help, before I hurt somebody." Hopefully, those can be some of the returns on the investment you've made in this story there.
Yeah,
So,
and the beautiful thing at the end of the book, she does say that she does forgive everybody.
yeah,
Um,
she
you,
does.
you went through this journey with her where she was very, very angry and upset with people, but at the end, she kind of realizes, if I'm going to move on with my life, I need to forgive everybody and then move on from Schmitty.
And that brings up I mean, that's a very good thing. Forgiveness. I mean, it's a very, obviously very biblical concept. She takes it from the Judeo-Christian perspective, which is where I come from. And I remember reading Joey Kramer's book from Aerosmith and his letter of forgiveness to his dad for all the abuse. That's more for the writer than it is for the receiver. And I think that that's a very healthy thing that Diane did. And obviously I think there's an energy that flows from that to the people that she's granting that forgiveness to. And so I think that's great. I hope in some way that the rest of her days can somehow be much brighter. And maybe this book is releasing that for her in a
Absolutely.
way that would be, she's certainly been through several lifetimes of hell. And I wouldn't wish that on my worst enemy. And she certainly doesn't sound like she deserved that. So
And on a happy note, she has 5 children, and they've all gone on to do wonderful things. She's very proud of them. She's a very, very happy grandmother. She dotes on her grandkids. So there is
good.
happiness in her life.
Good, good. I'm glad to hear that. I really am. Well, buddy, I will let you know when this thing is posting, probably in the next week or so, maybe even as soon as next week. Is that too soon for you, or you prefer it closer
That's
to the
fine.
release?
You'll be the first.
Okay, I will try to get that done this weekend, and then it'll post on Wednesday. And in the meantime, if you got anything else going on that you like to share, my door is always open to you, man.
Appreciate it. I'll send you the Sebring manuscript as soon as we get off.
All right, sounds good, man. I want a signed copy of this one for my
Oh, you got
collection.
it. I'll get Diane to sign it as well.
Oh, that would be phenomenal. I would love that. I'd love that. So, all right, my friend, we'll talk soon. Take care.
Okay, bye.